somewhere on your body. If you're an average human being who has ever had close physical contact with another person, there's a reasonable chance you've hosted a specific kind of insect that has been quietly riding along with our species for a genuinely absurd length of time. Lice. Small, blood-feeding, deeply unglamorous parasites that most people associate with an awkward note sent home from elementary school. And it turns out those exact insects, the ones nobody wants to think about for longer than necessary, hold one of the most precise, most genuinely brilliant pieces of evidence scientists have ever used to answer a question that seems like it should be completely unanswerable. When did humans start wearing clothes? Think about why that question is so hard in the first place. Clothing doesn't fossilize. A leather wrap, a woven fiber garment, anything an ancient human might have worn to cover their newly bare skin, rots away completely within decades, maybe centuries under perfect conditions, but almost never survives the tens of thousands of years separating us from the moment clothing was actually invented. There's no ancient shirt sitting in a museum from 100,000 years ago. There's no zipper, no button, no scrap of fabric researchers can carbon date. By every conventional archaeological standard, this should be an unanswerable question, permanently lost to time. And yet researchers figured it out anyway, with a level of precision that genuinely sounds made up the first time you hear it, by turning to an entirely different kind of evidence. A parasite that had absolutely no idea it was about to become one of the most useful historical witnesses in the entire field of human evolution. Let's start with the biology, because understanding why this method works at all requires knowing something most people have never had a reason to learn. Not all lice are the same species, and more importantly, not all lice live in the same place. Head lice, the species most people are at least vaguely familiar with, specifically evolved to cling to hair, gripping individual strands with specialized claws shaped precisely for that purpose, and laying their eggs, called nits, cemented directly onto hair shafts close to the scalp, where body warmth keeps them viable. Body lice, a genuinely distinct species, evolved to do something completely different. They live not on skin or hair at all, but in clothing, specifically in the seams and fibers of fabric worn close to the body, venturing out only briefly to feed directly on skin before retreating back into the fabric to lay their eggs there instead. Here's the detail that makes this whole method work, and it's genuinely elegant once you see it laid out clearly. Body lice cannot survive without clothing. This isn't a preference or a habitat choice in the way you might choose a favorite neighborhood. It's a hard biological requirement. Without fabric to retreat into, without seams to lay eggs in, body lice simply cannot complete their life cycle, and the population collapses entirely. Which means, from an evolutionary standpoint, body lice as a distinct species could not have existed, could not have evolved, could not have carved out their own separate ecological niche, before clothing itself already existed for them to live in. The parasite's entire existence is downstream of, and completely dependent on, the invention of the exact product researchers were trying to date. So here's the actual scientific move researchers made, and it's a genuinely clever piece of detective work. If body lice can only exist because clothing exists, then figuring out when body lice first evolved as a genetically distinct species, splitting off from their head lice ancestors, would effectively tell you when clothing was invented too, or at least give you a reliable minimum date for it. And figuring out when two closely related species genetically diverge from each other is something modern genetics is actually very good at. Using something called a molecular clock, the same basic principle we've discussed on this channel before in a completely different context. DNA accumulates mutations at a roughly steady, statistically predictable rate over time. Compare the genetic differences between two related populations, or in this case, two closely related species, and you can calculate roughly how long ago they shared a single common ancestor, essentially using the mutations themselves as a kind of biological stopwatch that's been quietly ticking the entire time, with nobody around to read it until modern genetic sequencing technology finally made that reading possible. A team of researchers, in a study led by geneticist Mark Stoneking published in the early 2000s, sequenced DNA from both head lice and body lice populations collected from multiple locations around the world and calculated the genetic divergence between the two species using this molecular clock method. Their results placed the split somewhere between approximately 170,000 and 83,000 years ago, a range that, while admittedly wide, given the genuine statistical uncertainty involved in any molecular clock calculation, was still narrow enough to represent a genuinely enormous leap forward in understanding this question, transforming it from a complete unknown into a specific, testable estimate for the very first time in the history of the field. Think about what that time frame actually places clothing alongside, because the dates aren't just a number floating in isolation, they connect directly to other major developments happening in human evolution around the same general period. This estimated window for the origin of clothing sits comfortably within the broader time frame anthropologists associate with anatomically modern Homo sapiens developing increasingly sophisticated behavior and technology, and notably, it predates, by a meaningful margin, the migrations of modern humans out of Africa into the considerably colder climates of Europe and Asia, migrations that most researchers place beginning somewhere around 70,000 years ago. That timing detail turns out to be genuinely significant, and it connects directly back to something we've covered before on this channel, the story of why humans lost their fur in the first place. Here's the piece that makes this genuinely fascinating rather than just a neat trivia fact, because it forces a reconsideration of why clothing was invented at all. If clothing genuinely originated somewhere in that 170 to 83,000 year window, it was likely already a regular part of human life before our ancestors ever encountered the freezing climates of an Ice Age Europe or Siberia that popular imagination usually assumes clothing was invented specifically to survive. Humans in that earlier time frame were still living primarily in Africa, in climates that, while certainly capable of getting cool at night, were nowhere near cold enough to make clothing an urgent survival necessity in the way it obviously would become later, once populations pushed into genuinely frigid northern latitudes. So why invent it at all, that early, in a climate that didn't strictly demand it? Several explanations have been proposed, and the honest answer is that it was probably several of these factors working together rather than any single tidy explanation. One possibility connects directly back to the fur loss story itself. If humans had already shed most of their body hair by this point in favor of that elaborate sweat-based cooling system we've discussed before, bare skin, while excellent for regulating heat during the day, would have left our ancestors considerably more vulnerable to cold nights, insect bites, and general environmental abrasion than a furred mammal, even in a climate that wasn't dramatically cold overall. A simple wrap or covering, even a fairly minimal one, could have offered meaningful protection against exactly those specific, everyday discomforts, long before anyone was thinking about surviving an actual ice age. There's also a genuinely compelling social and symbolic angle worth considering, because clothing, even in its earliest and most basic forms, likely served purposes well beyond pure practical protection almost immediately. Anthropologists studying the broader emergence of symbolic behavior in this general period, including deliberately worked ochre pigment and early personal ornamentation like shell beads, have noted that this time frame corresponds closely with a broader explosion in symbolic, socially communicative behavior across multiple different categories of evidence simultaneously. Clothing, in other words, may have emerged not purely as a practical necessity forced by climate, but partly as another expression of exactly the same growing capacity for symbolic thought and social signaling that was producing jewelry, pigment use, and increasingly complex toolmaking during that same general window. And then, once that foundational clothing technology already existed, already established as part of ordinary human life for tens of thousands of years, it turned out to be perfectly, almost providentially positioned to become an absolutely critical survival tool the moment human populations actually did start pushing into genuinely cold environments. When humans began migrating out of Africa and eventually into Ice Age Europe and Siberia, they weren't inventing clothing from scratch under desperate, freezing circumstances. They were adapting and intensifying a technology that had already existed, in some simpler form, for 100,000 years or more, refining it specifically for extreme cold rather than creating the basic concept for the first time under emergency conditions. That's a meaningfully different, and honestly more impressive, story than the popular invented out of desperate necessity version usually told. There's a broader point worth sitting with here as we close this out, because it says something genuinely remarkable about how modern science manages to answer questions that seem, on the surface, permanently unanswerable. Nobody could dig up a 100,000-year-old shirt. The physical evidence for clothing's origin simply doesn't exist, and by every conventional archaeological standard, that should have been the end of the story, an unknowable gap in human history that would stay unknowable forever. But researchers found the answer anyway, encoded not in fabric, not in any artifact humans deliberately created, but in the DNA of an unglamorous, universally unloved parasite that had been quietly, accidentally keeping a genetic record of our species' behavior the entire time, without a single person alive at the time ever knowing it was happening. The next time something as small and unremarkable as a louse crosses your mind, even in the most passing, dismissive way, it's worth remembering that these exact creatures, riding along on human bodies for tens of thousands of years, turned out to be silently carrying one of the most precise historical records our species has ever managed to recover about itself.